Chapter 2.3 The Dialectics of Colonial Sovereignty. Quote, to Toussaint Louverture, Toussaint, the most unhappy man of men, whether the whistling rustic tend his plough within thy hearing, or thy head be now pilled in some deep dungeon's earless den, O miserable chieftain, where and when wilt thou find patience, yet die not? Do thou wear rather in thy bonds a cheerful brow. Though fallen thyself, never to rise again, live and take comfort. Thou hast left behind powers that will work for thee, air, earth, and skies. There's not a breath of the common wind that will not forget thee. Thou hast great allies. Thy friends are exaltations, agonies, and love, and man's unconquerable mind. End quote, by William Wordsworth. We now need to take a step back and examine the genealogy of the concept of sovereignty from the perspective of colonialism. The crisis of modernity has from the beginning had an intimate relation to racial subordination and colonization. Whereas within its domain, the nation-state and its attendant ideological structures work tirelessly to create and reproduce the purity of the people, on the outside, the nation-state is a machine that produces others, creates racial difference, and raises boundaries that delimit and support the modern subject of sovereignty. These boundaries and barriers, however, are not impermeable, but rather serve to regulate two-way flows between Europe and its outside. The Oriental, the African, the Amero-Indian are all necessary components for the negative foundation of European identity and modern sovereignty as such. The dark other of European enlightenment stands as its very foundation, just as the productive relationship with the dark continents serve as the economic foundation of the European nation-states. The racial conflict intrinsic to European modernity is another symptom of the permanent crisis that defines modern sovereignty. The colony stands in dialectical opposition to European modernity as its necessary double and irrepressible antagonist. Colonial sovereignty is another insufficient attempt to resolve the crisis of modernity. Humankind is one in many. The age of European discovery and the progressively intense communication among the spaces and peoples of the earth that followed have always carried with them a real utopian element. But so much blood has been spilled, so many lives and cultures destroyed, that it seems much more urgent to denounce the barbarity and horror of Western European, and then also US, Soviet, and Japanese, expansion and control over the globe. We think it important, however, not to forget the utopian tendencies that have always accompanied the progression toward globalization, even if these tendencies have continually been defeated by the powers of modern sovereignty. The love of differences and the belief in the universal freedom and equality of humanity proper to the revolutionary thought of Renaissance humanism reappear here on a global scale. This utopian element of globalization is what prevents us from simply falling back into particularism and isolationism in reaction to the totalizing forces of imperialism and racist domination, pushing us instead to forge a project of counter-globalization, counter-empire. This utopian moment, however, has never been unambiguous. It is a tendency that constantly conflicts with sovereign order and domination. We see three exemplary expressions of this utopianism in all its ambiguity in the thought of Bartolomé de las Casas, Toussaint Louverture, and Karl Marx. In the first half-century after the European landing in the Americas at Hispaniola, Bartolomé de las Casas witnessed with horror the barbarity of the conquistadors and colonialists and their enslavement and genocide of the Mara Indians. The majority of the Spanish military, administrators, and colonists, hungry for gold and power, saw the occupants of this new world as irrevocably other, less than human, or at least naturally subordinate to Europeans. And Las Casas recounts for us how the newly arrived Europeans treated them worse than their animals. In this context, it is a wonder that Las Casas, who was part of the Spanish mission, could separate himself enough from the common stream of opinion to insist on the humanity of the Amerindians and contest the brutality of the Spanish rulers. His protest arises from one simple principle: humankind is one and equal. One should recognize at the same time, however, that a missionary vocation is intrinsically linked to the humanitarian project of the good bishop of Chiapas. In fact, Las Casas can think equality only in terms of sameness. The Amerindians are equal to Europeans in nature only insofar as they are potentially European, or really potentially Christian. The nature of men is the same, and all are called by Christ in the same way. Las Casas cannot see beyond the Eurocentric view of the Americas, in which the highest generosity and charity would be bringing the Amerindians under the control and tutelage of the true religion and its culture. The natives are undeveloped potential Europeans. In this sense, Las Casas belongs to a discourse that extends well into the 20th century on the perfectibility of the savages. For the Amerindians, just as for the Jews of 16th century Spain, the path to freedom from persecution must pass first through Christian conversion. Las Casas is really not so far from the Inquisition. He recognizes that humankind is one, but cannot see that it is also simultaneously many. More than 2 centuries after Las Casas, in the late 18th century, when Europe's domination over the Americas had changed form from conquest, massacre, and pillage to the more stable colonial structure of large-scale slave production and trade exclusives, a black slave named Toussaint Louverture led the first successful independence struggle against modern slavery in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti. Toussaint Louverture breathed in the rhetoric of the French Revolution emanating from Paris in its pure form. If the French revolutionaries opposing the ancien regime proclaimed the universal human right to liberté, égalité, et fraternité, Toussaint assumed that the blacks, mulattoes, and whites of the colony were also included under the broad umbrella of the rights of citizens. He took the victory over the feudal aristocracy and the exaltation of universal values in Europe to imply also the victory over the race aristocracy and the abolition of slavery. All will now be free citizens, equal brothers in the new French Republic. The letters of Toussaint to French military and governmental leaders pursue the rhetoric of the revolution faultlessly to its logical conclusion, and thereby reveal its hypocrisy. Perhaps naively, or perhaps as a conscious political tactic, Toussaint demonstrates how the leaders of the revolution betray the principles they claim to hold most dear. In a report to the Directory on November 5, 1797, Toussaint warned the French leaders that any return to slavery, any compromise of principles, would be impossible. A declaration of freedom is irreversible. Quote, "Do you think that men who have enjoyed the blessing of liberty will calmly see it snatched away? But no, the same hand that has broken our chains will not enslave us anew. France will not revoke her principles. She will not withdraw from us the greatest of her benefits." End quote. The proclamations of universal rights launched so confidently in Paris came back from Saint-Domingue only to strike horror in the hearts of the French. In the voyages across the Atlantic, the universality of the ideals became more real and were put into practice. As Aimé Césaire puts it, Toussaint Louverture pushed this project forward across a terrain, quote, "that separates the only thought from concrete reality, right from its actualization, reason from its proper truth." End quote. Toussaint takes the Declaration of the Rights of Man to the letter and insists on its full translation into practice. The revolution under Toussaint does not seek liberation from European domination only to return to a lost African world or reestablish in isolation traditional forms of rule. Toussaint looks forward to the forms of liberty and equality newly made available in the increasingly interconnected world. At times, however, Toussaint writes as if the very idea of freedom had been created by the French, and as if he and his insurgent companions are free only by the grace of Paris. This may be a merely rhetorical strategy of Toussaint's, an example of his ironic obsequiousness toward the French rulers, but certainly one should not think freedom to be a European idea. The slaves of Saint-Domingue had revolted against their masters ever since their capture and forced immigration from Africa. They were not granted freedom, but won it through bloody and tireless battle. Neither the desire for freedom nor its conquest originated in France, and the blacks of Saint-Domingue did not need the Parisians to teach them to fight for it. What Toussaint does receive and make good use of is the specific rhetoric of the French revolutionaries that gives legitimate form to his quest for liberation. In the 19th century, Karl Marx, like Las Casas and Toussaint Louverture before him, recognized the utopian potential of the ever-increasing processes of global interaction and communication. Like Las Casas, Marx was horrified by the brutality of European conquest and exploitation. Capitalism was born in Europe through the blood and sweat of conquered and colonized non-European peoples. Quote, the veiled slavery of the wage laborers in Europe needed the unqualified slavery of the New World as its pedestal. End quote. Like Toussaint Louverture, Marx recognized human freedom as a universal project to be realized through practice and from which no population should be excluded. The global utopian vein in Marx is nonetheless ambiguous, perhaps even more so than the other two cases, as we can see clearly from the series of articles he wrote for the New York Daily Tribune in 1853 on British rule in India. Marx's primary goal in these articles was to explain the debate going on at the time in the British Parliament over the status of the East India Company and situate the debate in the history of British colonial rule. Marx is, of course, quick to note the brutality of the introduction of British civilization into India and the havoc and suffering wrought by the rapacious greed of British capital and the British government. He immediately warns, however, in terms that bring us right back to the revolutionary phase of the Renaissance, against simply reacting to the barbarity of the British by supporting blindly the status quo of Indian society. The village system that Marx understood to pre-exist the British colonial intrusion was nothing to be championed. Sickening as it must be to human feelings to witness the destruction and suffering caused by the British, quote, we must not forget that these idyllic village communities, inoffensive though they may appear, had always been the solid foundation of Oriental despotism, that they restrained the human mind within the smallest possible compass, making it the unresisting tool of superstition, enslaving it beneath the traditional rules, depriving it of all grandeur and historical energies. End quote. Neither does the ruling structure of Indian princes deserve support, even in reaction to the British. Quote, it is not a strange thing that these same men who denounce the barbarous splendors of the crown and aristocracy of England are shedding tears at the downfall of Indian nabobs, Rajas, and Jagadars, the great majority of whom possess not even the prestige of antiquity, being generally usurpers of very recent date, set up by English intrigue. End quote. The colonial situation falls too easily into a choice between two bad alternatives, either submission to British capital and British rule, or return to traditional Indian social structures and submission to Indian princes, either foreign domination or local domination. For Marx, there must be another path that refuses both of these alternatives, a path of insubordination and freedom. In this sense, in creating the conditions of possibility for a new society, quote, whatever may have been the crimes of England, she was a conscious tool of history in bringing about that revolution, end quote. Capital can, in certain circumstances, be a force of enlightenment. Like Toussaint, then, Marx saw no use in overthrowing foreign domination simply to restore some isolated and traditional form of oppression. The alternative must look forward to a new form of freedom, connected to the expansive networks of global exchange. The only alternative path Marx can imagine, however, is that same path that European society has already traveled. Marx has no conception of the difference of Indian society, the different potentials it contains. He can thus see the Indian past only as vacant and static. Quote, Indian society has no history at all, at least no known history. What we call its history is but the history of the successive intruders who founded their empires on the passive basis of that unresisting and unchanging society. End quote. The claim that Indian society has no history means not that nothing has happened in India, but that the course of events has been determined exclusively by external forces, while Indian society has remained passive, unresisting, and unchanging. Certainly, Marx is limited by his scant knowledge of India's present and past. His lack of information, however, is not the point. The central issue is that Marx can conceive of history outside of Europe only as moving strictly along the path already traveled by Europe itself. England has to fulfill a double mission in India, he wrote, one destructive, the other regenerating, the annihilation of old Asiatic society and the laying of the material foundations of Western society in Asia. India can progress only by being transformed into a Western society. All the world can move forward only by following the footsteps of Europe. Marx's Eurocentrism is in the end not so different from that of Las Casas. The crisis of colonial slavery. Although the utopian vein has continually surfaced in the historical process of the interconnection and intercommunication of the world in the modern period, it has nonetheless continually been suppressed militarily and ideologically by the forces of European domination. The primary result has been massacres on a scale never before imagined, and the establishment of racial, political, and economic structures of European rule over the non-European world. The rise of European supremacy was driven in large part by the development and spread of capitalism, which fed Europe's seemingly insatiable thirst for wealth. The global expansion of capitalism, however, was neither a uniform nor a univocal process. In various regions and among different populations, capitalism developed unevenly. It lurched forward, hesitated, and retreated according to a variety of diverse paths. One such circuitous path is traced by the history of large-scale colonial slave production in the Americas between the late 17th and mid-19th centuries, a history that is not pre-capitalist, but rather within the complex and contradictory developments of capital. Large-scale plantation production with slave labor was initiated in the Caribbean in the mid-17th century by English and French planters, who imported African slaves to fill the void left by the native peoples killed by European weapons and disease. By the end of the 18th century, the products of slave labor in the Americas constituted one-third of the value of European commerce. European capitalism stood in a very ambiguous relation to the slave production in the Americas. One might reason logically, as many have, that since capitalism is based ideologically and materially on free labor, or really on the worker's ownership of his or her own labor power, capitalism must be antithetical to slave labor. From this perspective, colonial slavery would be seen as a pre-existing form of production analogous to feudalism that capital succeeds gradually in overcoming. The capitalist ideology of freedom would in this case be an unalloyed force of enlightenment. Capital's relation to colonial slavery, however, is in fact much more intimate and complex. First of all, even though capitalism's ideology is indeed antithetical to slavery, in practice, capital nonetheless not only subsumed and reinforced existing slave production systems throughout the world, but also created new systems of slavery on an unprecedented scale, particularly in the Americas. One might interpret capital's creation of slave systems as a kind of apprenticeship to capitalism, in which slavery would function as a transitional stage between the natural, that is, self-sufficient and isolated economies that pre-existed European intrusion, and capitalism proper. Indeed, the scale and organization of the 18th century Caribbean plantations did foreshadow in certain respects the 19th century European industrial plant. The slave production in the Americas and the African slave trade, however, were not merely or even predominantly a transition to capitalism. They were a relatively stable support, a pedestal of super-exploitation on which European capitalism stood. There is no contradiction here. Slave labor in the colonies made capitalism in Europe possible, and European capital had no interest in giving it up. In the very same period when European powers constructed the bases of the slave economy across the Atlantic, there was also in Europe, principally in Eastern but also in Southern Europe, a refeudalization of the agrarian economy, and thus a very strong tendency to block the mobility of labor and freeze the conditions of the labor market. Europe was thrown back into a second period of servitude. The point here is not merely to denounce the irrationality of the bourgeoisie, but to understand how slavery and servitude can be perfectly compatible with capitalist production, as mechanisms that limit the mobility of the labor force and block its movements. Slavery and servitude, and all other guises of the coercive organization of labor, from coolieism in the Pacific and peonage in Latin America to apartheid in South Africa, are all essential elements internal to the processes of capitalist development. In this period, slavery and wage labor engaged each other as dance partners in the coordinated steps of capitalist development. Certainly, many noble and enlightened proponents of abolitionism in Europe and the Americas in the late 18th and early 19th centuries argued against slavery on moral grounds. The abolitionist arguments had some real force. However, only when they serve the interests of capital, for example, when they serve to undercut the profits of a competitor's slave production. Even then, however, their force is quite limited. In fact, neither moral arguments at home nor calculations of profitability abroad could move European capital to dismantle the slave regimes. Only the revolt and revolution of slaves themselves could provide an adequate lever. Just as capital moves forward to restructure production and employ new technologies only as a response to the organized threat of worker antagonism, so too European capital would not relinquish slave production until the organized slaves posed a threat to their power and made that system of production untenable. In other words, slavery was not abandoned for economic reasons, but rather overthrown by political forces. Political unrest did, of course, undercut the economic profitability of the system, but more important, the slaves in revolt came to constitute a real counterpower. The Haitian Revolution was certainly the watershed in modern history of slave revolt, and its specter circulated throughout the Americas in the early 19th century, just as the specter of the October Revolution haunted European capitalism over a century later. One should not forget, however, that revolt and antagonism were a constant part of slavery throughout the Americas, from New York City to Bahia. The economy of slavery, like the economy of modernity itself, was an economy of crisis. The claim that regimes of slavery and servitude are internal to capitalist production and development points toward the intimate relationship between the laboring subject's desire to flee the relationship of command and capital's attempts to block the population within fixed territorial boundaries. Jan Moulier-Boutong emphasizes the primacy of these lines of flight in the history of capitalist development. Quote, "An anonymous, collective, continuous, and uncontainable force of defection is what has driven the labor market toward freedom. This same force is what has obliged liberalism to produce the apology of free labor, the right to property, and open borders. It has also forced the bourgeois economists to establish models that immobilize labor, discipline it, and disregard the elements of uninterrupted flight. All of this has functioned to invent and reinvent 1,000 forms of slavery. This ineluctable aspect of accumulation perceives the question of the proletarianization of the liberal era and constructs a basis of the modern state." End quote. The deterritorializing desire of the multitude is the motor that drives the entire process of capitalist development, and capital must constantly attempt to contain it. The production of alterity. Colonialism and racial subordination function as a temporary solution to the crisis of European modernity, not only in economic and political terms, but also in terms of identity and culture. Colonialism constructs figures of alterity and manages their flows in what unfolds as a complex dialectical structure. The negative construction of non-European others is finally what founds and sustains European identity itself. Colonial identity functions first of all through a Manichaean logic of exclusion. As Franz Fanon tells us, the colonial world is a world cut in two. The colonized are excluded from European spaces not only in physical and territorial terms, and not only in terms of rights and privileges, but even in terms of thought and values. The colonized subject is constructed in the metropolitan imaginary as other, and thus, as far as possible, the colonized is cast outside the defining bases of European civilized values. We can't reason with them, they can't control themselves, they don't respect the value of human life, they only understand violence. Racial difference is a sort of black hole that can swallow up all the capacities for evil, barbarism, unrestrained sexuality, and so forth. The dark colonized subject thus seems at first obscure and mysterious in its otherness. This colonial construction of identities rests heavily on the fixity of the boundary between metropole and colony. The purity of the identities in both biological and cultural senses is of utmost importance. The maintenance of the boundary is cause for considerable anxiety. All values, in fact, Fanon points out, are irrevocably poisoned and diseased as soon as they are allowed in contact with the colonized race. The boundaries protecting this pure European space are continually under siege. Colonial law operates primarily around these boundaries, both in that it supports their exclusionary function and in that it applies differently to the subjects on the two sides of the divide. Apartheid is simply one form, perhaps the emblematic form, of the compartmentalization of the colonial world. The barriers that divide the colonial world are not simply erected on natural boundaries. Even though there are almost always physical markers that help naturalize the division, alterity is not given but produced. This premise is a common point of departure for a wide range of research that has emerged in recent decades, including notably Edward Said's seminal book, quote, "I have begun with the assumption that the Orient is not an inert fact of nature, that the Orient was created, or as I call it, orientalized," end quote. Orientalism is not simply a scholarly project to gain more accurate knowledge of a real object, the Orient, but rather a discourse that creates its own object in the unfolding of the discourse itself. The two primary characteristics of this Orientalist project are its homogenization of the Orient from Maghreb to India, Orientals everywhere are all nearly the same, and its essentialization. The Orient and the Oriental character are timeless and unchanging identities. The result, as Said points out, is not the Orient as it is, an empirical object, but the Orient as it has been orientalized, an object of European discourse. The Orient, then, at least as we know it through Orientalism, is a creation of discourse, made in Europe and exported back to the Orient. The representation is at once a form of creation and a form of exclusion. Among the academic disciplines involved in the cultural production of ulteriority, anthropology was perhaps the most important rubric under which the native order was imported to and exported from Europe. From the real differences in non-European peoples, 19th century anthropologists constructed another being of a different nature. Differential cultural and physical traits were construed as the essence of the African, the Arab, the Aboriginal, and so forth. When colonial expansion was at its peak, and European powers were engaged in the scramble for Africa, anthropology and the study of non-European peoples became not only a scholarly endeavor, but also a broad field for public instruction. The other was imported to Europe, in natural history museums, public exhibitions of primitive peoples, and so forth, and thus made increasingly available for the popular imaginary. In both its scholarly and its popular forms, 19th century anthropology presented non-European subjects and cultures as undeveloped versions of Europeans and their civilization. They were signs of primitiveness that represented stages on the road to European civilization. The diachronic stages of humanity's evolution towards civilization were thus conceived as present synchronically in the various primitive peoples and cultures spread across the globe. The anthropological presentation of non-European others within this evolutionary theory of civilizations served to confirm and validate the eminent position of Europeans, and thereby legitimate the colonialist project as a whole. Important segments of the discipline of history were also deeply embedded in the scholarly and popular production of alterity, and thus also in the legitimation of colonial rule. For example, upon arriving in India and finding no historiography they could use, British administrators had to write their own Indian history to sustain and further the interests of colonial rule. The British had to historicize the Indian past in order to have access to it and put it to work. This British creation of an Indian history, however, like the formation of the colonial state, could be achieved only by imposing European colonial logics and models on Indian reality. India's past was thus annexed so as to become merely a portion of British history, or rather, British scholars and administrators created an Indian history and exported it to India. This historiography supported the Raj, and in turn made the past inaccessible to Indians as history. The reality of India and Indians was thus supplanted by a powerful representation that posed them as an other to Europe, a primitive stage in the teleology of civilization. The Dialectic of Colonialism. In the logic of colonialist representations, the construction of a separate colonized other and the segregation of identity and alterity turns out paradoxically to be at once absolute and extremely intimate. The process consists in fact of two moments that are dialectically related. In the first moment, difference has to be pushed to the extreme. In the colonial imaginary, the colonized is not simply an other, banished outside the realm of civilization. Rather, it is grasped or produced as other, as the absolute negation, as the most distant point on the horizon. 18th century colonial slaveholders, for example, recognized the absoluteness of this difference clearly. Quote, "The Negro is a being whose nature and dispositions are not merely different from those of the European. They are the reverse of them. Kindness and compassion excite in his breast implacable and deadly hatred, but stripes and insults and abuse generate gratitude, affection, and inviolable attachment." End quote. Thus, the slaveholder's mentality, according to an abolitionist pamphlet. The non-European subject acts, speaks, and thinks in a manner exactly opposite to the European. Precisely because the difference of this other is absolute, it can be inverted in a second moment as a foundation of the self. In other words, the evil, barbarity, and licentiousness of the colonized other are what make possible the goodness, civility, and propriety of the European self. What first appears strange, foreign, and distant thus turns out to be very close and intimate. Knowing, seeing, and even touching the colonized is essential, even if this knowledge and contact take place only on the plane of representation and relate little to the actual subjects in the colonies and the metropole. The intimate struggle with the slave, feeling the sweat on his skin, smelling its odor, defines the vitality of the master. This intimacy, however, in no way blurs the division between the two identities in struggle, but only makes more important the boundaries and the purity of the identities be policed. The identity of the European self is produced in this dialectical movement. Once the colonial subject is constructed as absolutely other, it can in turn be subsumed, cancelled and raised up within a higher unity. The absolute other is reflected back into the most proper. Only through opposition to the colonized does the metropolitan subject really become itself. What first appears as a simple logic of exclusion, then, turns out to be a negative dialectic of recognition. The colonizer does produce the colonized negation, but, through a dialectical twist, that negative colonized identity is negated in turn to found the positive colonizer self. Modern European thought and the modern self are both necessarily bound to what Paul Gilroy calls the relationship of racial terror and subordination. The gilded monuments not only of European cities, but also of modern European thought itself, are founded on the intimate dialectical struggle with its others. We should be careful to note that the colonial world never really conformed to the simple two-part division of this dialectical structure. Any analysis of 18th century Haitian society before the revolution, for example, cannot consider only whites and blacks, but must also take into account, at least, the position of mulattoes, who were at times united with whites on the basis of their property and freedom, and at times united with blacks because of their non-white skin. Even in simple racial terms, this social reality demands at least three axes of analysis, but that too fails to grasp the real social divisions. One must also recognize a conflict among whites of different classes in the interests of the black slaves as distinct from those of the free blacks and maroons. In short, the real social situation in the colonies never breaks down neatly into an absolute binary between pure opposing forces. Reality always presents proliferating multiplicities. Our argument here, however, is not that reality presents this facile binary structure, but that colonialism, as an abstract machine that produces identities and ulteriorities, imposes binary divisions on the colonial world. Colonialism homogenizes real social differences by creating one overriding opposition that pushes differences to the absolute, and then subsumes the opposition under the identity of European civilization. Reality is not dialectical, colonialism is. The work of numerous authors, such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Frantz Fanon, who have recognized that colonial representations and colonial sovereignty are dialectical in form, has proven useful in several respects. First of all, the dialectical construction demonstrates that there is nothing essential about the identities in struggle. The white and the black, the European and the Oriental, the colonizer and the colonized are all representations that function only in relation to each other, and despite appearances, have no real necessary basis in nature, biology, or rationality. Colonialism is an abstract machine that produces alterity and identity. And yet, in the colonial situation, these differences in identities are made to function as if they were absolute, essential, and natural. The first result of the dialectical reading is thus the denaturalization of racial and cultural differences. This does not mean that once recognized as artificial construction, colonial identities evaporate into thin air. They are real illusions and continue to function as if they were essential. This recognition is not a politics in itself, but merely the sign that an anti-colonial politics is possible. In the second place, the dialectical interpretation makes clear that colonialism and colonialist representations are grounded in a violent struggle that must be continually renewed. The European self needs violence and needs to confront its other to feel and maintain its power, to remake itself continually. The generalized state of war that continuously subtends colonial representations is not accidental or even unwanted. Violence is a necessary foundation of colonialism itself. Third, posing colonialism as a negative dialectic of recognition makes clear the potential for subversion inherent in the situation. For a thinker like Fanon, the reference to Hegel suggests that the master can only achieve a hollow form of recognition. It is the slave, through life and death struggle, who has the potential to move forward toward full consciousness. The dialectic ought to imply movement, but this dialectic of European sovereign identity has fallen back into stasis. The failed dialectic suggests the possibility of a proper dialectic that through negativity will move history forward. The Boomerang of Alterity. Many authors, particularly during the long season of intense decolonization struggles from the end of World War II to the 1960s, argued that this positive dialectic of colonialism that founds and stabilizes European sovereign identity should be challenged by a properly negative and hence revolutionary dialectic. We cannot defeat the colonialist production of alterity, these authors claimed, simply by revealing the artificiality of the identities and differences created, and thereby hoping to arrive directly at an affirmation of the authentic universality of humanity. The only possible strategy is one of reversal or inversion of the colonialist logic itself. Quote, the unity which will come eventually, bringing all oppressed peoples together in the same struggle, must be preceded in the colonies by what I shall call the moment of separation or negativity. This anti-racist racism is the only road that will lead to the abolition of racial differences. End quote by Sartre. Sartre imagines that this negative dialectic will finally set history in motion. The negative dialectic has most often been conceived in cultural terms, for example, as a project of negritude, the quest to discover the black essence or unveil the black soul. According to this logic, the response to colonialist representations has to involve reciprocal and symmetrical representations, even if the blackness of the colonized is recognized as a production and a mystification constructed in the colonial imaginary. It is not denied or dispelled on account of that, but rather affirmed as essence. According to Sartre, the revolutionary poets of negritude, such as Aimé Césaire and Léopold Senghor, adopt the negative pole that they have inherited from the European dialectic and transform it into something positive, intensifying it, claiming it as a moment of self-consciousness. No longer a force of stabilization and equilibrium, the domesticated other has become savage, truly other, that is, capable of reciprocity and autonomous initiative. This, as Sartre announces so beautifully and ominously, is the moment of the boomerang. The negative moment is able to operate a reciprocal destruction of the European self, precisely because European society and its values are found in the domestication and negative subsumption of the colonized. The moment of negativity is posed as a necessary first step in a transition toward the ultimate goal of a raceless society that recognizes the equality, freedom, and common humanity of all. Despite the coherent dialectic logic of this Sartrean cultural politics, however, the strategy it proposes seems to us completely illusory. The power of the dialectic, which in the hands of the colonial power mystified the reality of the colonial world, is adopted again as part of an anti-colonial project, as if the dialectic were itself the real form of the movement of history. Reality and history, however, are not dialectical, and no idealist rhetorical gymnastics can make them conform to the dialectic. The strategy of negativity, however, the moment of the boomerang, appears in an entirely different light when it is cast in a non-dialectical form and in political rather than cultural terms. Fanon, for example, refuses the cultural politics of negritude with its consciousness of black identity and poses the revolutionary antithesis instead in terms of physical violence. The original moment of violence is that of colonialism, the domination and exploitation of the colonized by the colonizer. The second moment, the response of the colonized to this original violence, can take all sorts of perverted forms in the colonial context. Quote, The colonized man will first manifest his aggressiveness, which has been deposited in his bones against his own people. End quote. The violence among the colonized population, sometimes thought to be the residues of ancient tribal or religious antagonisms, is really the pathological reflections of the violence of colonialism that most often surfaces as superstitions, myths, dances, and mental disorders. Fanon does not recommend that the colonized should flee or avoid the violence. Colonialism, by its very operation, perpetuates this violence, and if it is not addressed directly, it will continue to manifest itself in these destructive, pathological forms. The only path to hell that Dr. Fanon can recommend is a reciprocal counter-violence. Moreover, this is the only path to liberation. The slave who never struggles for freedom, who is simply granted the permission of the master, will forever remain a slave. This is precisely the reciprocity that Malcolm X proposed as a strategy to address the violence of white supremacy in the United States. For both Fanon and Malcolm X, however, this negative moment, this violent reciprocity, does not lead to any dialectical synthesis. It is not the upbeat that will be resolved in a future harmony. This open negativity is merely the healthy expression of a real antagonism, a direct relation of force. Because it is not the means to a final synthesis, this negativity is not a politics in itself. Rather, it merely poses a separation from colonialist domination and opens the field for politics. The real political process of constitution will have to take place on this open terrain of forces with a positive logic, separate from the dialectics of colonial sovereignty. The poisoned gift of national liberation. Subaltern nationalism has indeed, as we argued in the previous section, served important progressive functions. The nation has served among subordinated groups both as a defensive weapon employed to protect the group against external domination and as a sign of the unity, autonomy, and power of the community. During the period of decolonization and after, the nation appears a necessary vehicle for political modernization and hence the ineluctable path toward freedom and self-determination. The promise of a global democracy among nations, including their formal equality and sovereignty, was written into the original Charter of the United Nations. The organization and its members shall act in accordance with the principle of the sovereign equality of all its members. National sovereignty means freedom from foreign domination and the self-determination of peoples, and thus signals a definitive defeat of colonialism. The progressive functions of national sovereignty, however, are always accompanied by powerful structures of internal domination. The perils of national liberation are even clearer when viewed externally, in terms of the world economic system in which the liberated nation finds itself. Indeed, the equation nationalism equals political and economic modernization, which has been heralded by leaders of numerous anti-colonial and anti-imperial struggles from Gandhi and Ho Chi Minh to Nelson Mandela, really ends up being a perverse trick. The equation serves to mobilize popular forces and galvanize a social movement. But where does the movement lead, and what interest does it serve? In most cases, it involves a delegated struggle, in which the modernization project also establishes in power the new ruling group that is charged with carrying it out. The revolution is thus offered up, hands and feet bound, to the new bourgeoisie. It is a February revolution, one might say, that should be followed by an October. But the calendar has gone crazy. October never comes, the revolutionaries get bogged down in realism, and modernization ends up lost in hierarchies of the world market. It is not the control exerted by the world market, however, the opposite of the nationalist dream of an autonomous, self-centered development. The nationalism of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggles effectively functions in reverse, and the liberated countries find themselves subordinated in the international economic order. The very concept of a liberatory national sovereignty is ambiguous, if not completely contradictory. While this nationalism seeks to liberate the multitude from foreign domination, it erects domestic structures of domination that are equally severe. The position of the newly sovereign nation-state cannot be understood when it is viewed in terms of the rosy UN imaginary of a harmonious concert of equal and autonomous national subjects. The post-colonial nation-state functions as an essential and subordinated element in the global organization of the capitalist market. As Partha Chatterjee argues, national liberation and national sovereignty are not just powerless against its global capitalist hierarchy, but themselves contribute to its organization and functioning. Quote, Nowhere in the world has nationalism qua nationalism challenged the legitimacy of the marriage between reason and capital. Nationalist thought does not possess the ideological means to make this challenge. The conflict between metropolitan capital and the people nation, it resolves by absorbing the political life of the nation to the body of the state. Conservatory of the passive revolution, the national state now proceeds to find for the nation a place in the global order of capital, while striving to keep the contradictions between capital and the people in perpetual suspension. All politics is now sought to be subsumed under the overwhelming requirements in the state representing the nation. End quote. The entire logical change of representation might be summarized like this: the people representing the multitude, the nation representing the people, and the state representing the nation. Each link is an attempt to hold in suspension the crisis of modernity. Representation in each case means a further step in abstraction and control. From India to Algeria and Cuba to Vietnam, the state is a poisoned gift of national liberation. The final link that explains the necessary subordination of the post-colonial nation-state, however, is the global order of capital. The global capitalist hierarchy that subordinates the formerly sovereign nation-states within its order is fundamentally different from the colonialist and imperialist circuits of international domination. The end of colonialism is also the end of the modern world and modern regimes of rule. The end of modern colonialisms, of course, has not really opened an age of unqualified freedom, but rather yielded to new forms of rule that operate on a global scale. Here we have our first real glimpse of the passage to empire. Contagion. When Louis Ferdinand Destouches Céline went to Africa, what he found was disease. In the unforgettable African passage of Journey to the End of the Night, the narrator, through the deliriums of his own fever, saw a population permeated through and through with disease. The natives in those parts suffered horribly from every communicable disease. Perhaps this is exactly what we should expect from Dr. Destouches, given that he was sent to Africa by the League of Nations to work as a hygienist. But of course, Céline was also working with a commonplace of colonial consciousness. There are two sides to the connection between colonialism and disease. First of all, simply the fact that the indigenous population is disease-ridden is itself a justification for the colonial project. These Negroes are sick. You'll see, they're completely corrupt. They're degenerates. Disease is a sign of physical and moral corruption, a sign of a lack of civilization. Colonialism's civilizing project, then, is justified by the hygiene it brings. On the other side of the coin, however, from the European perspective, the primary danger of colonialism is disease, or really contagion. In Africa, Louis Ferdinand finds every communicable disease. Physical contamination, moral corruption, madness. The darkness of the colonial territories and populations is contagious, and Europeans are always at risk. This is essentially the same truth that Kurtz recognized in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Once there's established the differential between the pure, civilized European and the corrupt, barbarous other, there is possible not only a civilizing process from disease to health, but also, ineluctably, the reverse process, from health to disease. Contagion is a constant and present danger, the dark underside of the civilizing mission. It is interesting in Céline's journey that the disease of colonial territories is a sign not really of death, but of an overabundance of life. The narrator, Louis Ferdinand, finds that not only the population, but moreover the African terrain itself is monstrous. The disease of the jungle is that life springs up everywhere. Everything grows without bounds. What a horror for a hygienist. The disease of the colony lets loose is the lack of boundaries on life, an unlimited contagion. If one looks back, Europe appears reassuringly sterile. Remember in Heart of Darkness that deathly pallor of Brussels that Marlowe finds in his return from the Belgian Congo. But with respect to the monstrous, unbounded overabundance of life, in the colony, the sterile environment of Europe seems comforting. The standpoint of the hygienist may in fact be the privileged position for recognizing the anxieties of colonialist consciousness. The horror released by European conquest and colonialism is a horror of unlimited contact, flow, and exchange, or really the horror of contagion, miscegenation, and unbounded life. Hygiene requires protective barriers. European colonialism was continuously plagued by contradictions between virtuous exchange and the danger of contagion, and hence it was characterized by a complex play of flows and hygienic boundaries between metropole and colony and among colonial territories. The contemporary processes of globalization have torn down many of the boundaries of the colonial world, along with the common celebrations of the unbounded flows in our new global village. One can still sense also an anxiety about increased contact and a certain nostalgia for colonialist hygiene. The dark side of the consciousness of globalization is a fear of contagion. If we break down global boundaries and open universal contact into our global village, how will we prevent the spread of disease and corruption? This anxiety is most clearly revealed with respect to the AIDS pandemic. The lightning speed of the spread of AIDS in the Americas, Europe, and Africa, and Asia demonstrate the new dangers of global contagion. As AIDS has been recognized first as a disease and then as a global pandemic, there have developed maps of its sources and spread that often focus on Central Africa and Haiti, in terms reminiscent to the colonialist imaginary: unrestrained sexuality, moral corruption, and lack of hygiene. Indeed, the dominant discourses of AIDS prevention have been all about hygiene. We must avoid contact and use protection. The medical and humanitarian workers have to throw up their hands in frustration working with these infected populations who have so little respect for hygiene. Think of what Dr. Destouche would say. International and supranational projects to stop the spread of AIDS have tried to establish protective boundaries at another level by requiring HIV tests in order to cross national boundaries. The boundaries of nation-states, however, are increasingly permeable by all kinds of flows. Nothing can bring back the hygienic shield of colonial boundaries. The age of globalization is the age of universal contagion.